In the modern world, the term slave trading is practically unheard of. But when we go back to the 17th or 18th century, we find a lot about human slavery, forced trade, and human trafficking. And we often find ourselves questioning, how did human society approve of human slavery for thousands of years? We remember the Atlantic slave trade as the biggest loss to humanity. We condemn the atrocities endured by those who were forcibly enslaved, and we strive for a society where every life matters. But in this video, we're going to delve into the lives of those who perpetrated these heinous acts, the slave traders themselves. By understanding their motivations and circumstances, we can gain insight into the complexities of this grim period in history. So make sure to watch this video till the end, and don't forget to subscribe Binge History for more content like this. Human slavery has existed in many forms for centuries. In fact, slave trading was considered a cultural and societal norm. Read the Code of Hammurabi from some 4,000 years ago, and you will see the word slaves plenty of times in it. This formal institution for slavery shows this practice has deeply entrenched roots in our history. But in the ancient European and Middle Eastern worlds, slavery was not based on race. Rather, it was the outcome of war. Those who lost in battle often became slaves. This practice wasn't just about subjugation, it also had economic benefits. However, keeping those prisoners was costly, so it was decided to turn these captives into slaves. It was beneficial both for traders who sold them for money and the owners who gained economically from their work. But when did slave trading become racial? When civilizations expanded and trade routes developed, the demand for labor grew, particularly in the burgeoning colonies of the Americas. The European powers were eager to capitalize on the economic opportunities presented by these new territories. As a result, this precedent of enslavement became more commercialized, inherited, and racialized. The prisoner-turned-slave approach evolved into an African-turned-slave version. So passively, slave traders turned to Africa as a ready source of labor. Continuing the legacy of earlier enslavement practices, European slave traders used concepts of racial superiority and inferiority to justify the enslavement of Africans. This racial mindset of slave traders led to the foundation of one of the darkest chapters of history, the Atlantic Slave Trade, a harrowing journey of 12.5 million slaves from Africa to Europe. In the 15th century, Portugal was a pioneer in African slave trading, marking the beginning of Europe's biggest involvement in the transatlantic slave trade. Initially, Portuguese traders sought slaves for labor on Atlantic African island plantations, later extending their trade to Brazil and the Caribbean, with a smaller portion sent to Europe. First, they attempted to acquire African labor through direct raids along the coast. However, their efforts proved costly due to the military strategies of West and Central African communities. So Portuguese traders shifted tactics. Why not make an alliance with African leaders instead? These people had slaves captured in various African conflicts. Therefore, these leaders consented to sell these slaves to Portuguese traders along with gold and other commodities in exchange for European and North African goods, either under pressure from the superpowers or drawn in by the money. By the 18th century, the British were the main importers of African slaves, followed by the French and Portuguese. The biggest motivation for the Atlantic slave trade was, of course, money. The demand for slave traders grew at lightning speed because the rewards of the transatlantic slave system were impressive. From 1630 to 1807, British slave traders pocketed approximately £12 million from buying and selling African people. These enslaved individuals were responsible for generating roughly 75% of the exports of raw materials from the newly established colonies. Many politicians and businessmen were directly or indirectly enjoying the benefits. Even William Ewart Gladstone, the four-time Prime Minister of Britain, and his family amassed significant wealth through their involvement in the sugar trade. Another prominent name in the African slave trade was John Hawkins. He got motivated by the scale of profit the Portuguese were making, so he followed. He trafficked almost 1,500 slaves from West Africa to the Spanish Caribbean in his first trade. After the success of the initial trade, his subsequent trades were sponsored by Queen Elizabeth I. So, that's clear why parliaments back then could not implement any slavery ban, because some big shots were on the road to riches. Another reason for these traders to embrace this brutal practice is that slave trading was considered a normal business, just like wildlife trading is today. You might be thinking that if these African leaders had not agreed to sell those captives to Portuguese traders earlier, we might not have had humanity lost in Africa, at least. However, when the Portuguese turned to Africa for slaves, this trading was already an established activity in other parts of the world, and this cultural diffusion turned African leaders into slave traders as well. Slave trading was normal, profitable, and racial, so African traders had in mind that if they weren't traders, they might be the victims. This psychological pressure, this fear of becoming a victim, might be one of the factors that drove them to continue trading humanity. Some African traders actually experienced both sides of the trade. Ayuba Suleiman Diallo, an African slave trader, shares his interesting life journey in the Gentleman's Magazine, 1750. In 1731, Ayuba was going to sell 2 slaves to a trader, but the negotiation did not go well, and he ended up selling the slaves to another African trader for cows. But while on his way back home, he got captured as a slave by Captain Pike, the same person he had tried to sell the slaves to. So, Ayuba was both the victim and the participant in slave trading. It shows the traders did not have any control over this global phenomenon. If they had, would Ayuba ever choose to be a victim? Another interesting part of Ayuba's story was that after he got freed, guess what he did? Despite experiencing the horrors of enslavement, he resumed his slave trading practices and worked for the English Royal African Company. Imagine a person driving a taxi for a living, getting into a fender bender, and visiting the hospital. After he returns, he resumes driving. Why so? Because driving is normal, road collisions are also normal. This was what Ayuba thought. For him and the rest of Africa, slave trading was a widely accepted phenomenon in the mid-18th century. These African traders were not the pioneers nor the abolitionists, but yes, they were a part of this brutal global practice. Having said that, there are a few examples in history where slave traders became abolitionists after a spiritual awakening. One such example is of a British slave trader turned abolitionist, John Newton. His sea career led him into the brutal world of the slave trade. But he underwent a profound transformation after experiencing a religious conversion and became a vocal advocate for the abolition of slavery. So the lives of Atlantic slave traders were perplexed. Economic benefits, political power, psychological pressure, and societal implications have led them to be a part of this darkest history. Within a century, in the mid-19th century, this global norm became a thing of the past, banned completely. Yes, the freedom fighters and powerful campaigns played a role, but technology was a major player. When technology advanced to the point that it became cheaper and more efficient than human labor, slavery became economically unsustainable. This coincided with political and social systems, especially in Europe and America, which began placing greater value on individual dignity and rights. Therefore, the slave traders, who were driven by social conventions and financial gain, had to give up this business. So, what the lives of Atlantic slave traders tell us is if a nefarious act is widely accepted, it becomes the norm. When a global awakening abolishes it, it becomes a dark chapter of history. It's all about evolution. For the slave traders of the 17th and 18th centuries, slave trading was completely normal. But for us, in this day and age, we see it as one of the worst crimes against humanity ever recorded. For our generation, house help is normal. But who knows? In the future, if robots end up taking over those chores, your future generation might be shocked to learn that their ancestors used to rely on humans as servants in their homes. So here we are, in the shadowy annals of history, closely analyzing the motivations of people whose lives were defined by the brutal business of buying and selling human beings in transatlantic slave trade history. Thumbs up if you like this video, and hit the bell icon to listen to more interesting sections of human history.